Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, more than half of Europeans believe the European Union is likely to collapse within a generation. Now, this comes despite support, in fact, for the bloc hitting record heights that have not been recorded in more than a quarter of a century. This all according to a survey that has been commissioned by the European Council on Foreign Relations. That is a think tank. Just to give you an example of one of the polling numbers that has come out is that 58% of French believe, for example, that the EU is very likely or fairly likely to fall apart within 20 years. This is, of course, at a time of Brexit, growing populist parties throughout the continent, especially far-right parties. What does all of this mean for the future of the EU going into these European parliamentary elections? To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Mr. Mark Brolin, who is a political analyst, economist, and author of A State of Independence, Why the EU is the Problem, Not the Solution. He's joining us now by Skype from London. We're also joined by Dr. Sotiris Serbos, who is a professor of international politics at Demokritos University of Thrace. He's joining us now from Thessaloniki in Greece. Sotiris and Mark, thank you both for joining us. Mark, I wonder what you make of such polls. Can they be relied upon? Do you think Europeans are losing hope in the EU?
I certainly think so to some degree, but I think many people still see the EU as a peace project. I think that's, in my view, that's a myth. But many people believe that myth. It's a strong myth, and it has to be peddled by the EU because the whole project sort of depends on it. And so it is sort of peddled relentlessly, and many people still believe it. But I think support is in decline because I think 15, 20 years ago, all of us were EU enthusiasts, and now we tend to see the EU as the best way to stay. It's better to stay than to leave, but we still see it as more problematic. And as regards to the problem, why people see that it's going to fall apart, I think people are seeing Brexit as a problem. They think it's not going to work out, and they see it as an example of what happens. It's going to be problematic to leave. But they also see all the problems the EU is having. We have the Brexit problem, we have the immigration mess, and we have the ticking Eurobomb and all these things. So they see the parts of discontent are growing, and that's why people are sort of understanding that it's not going to last forever, but I still like it because I still think it is a peace project.
All right, so Sotiris, where did the EU go wrong, do you think? Why are EU citizens unhappy?
I think, first of all, it's important to try to tackle the root causes of this paradox. So from the one hand, you have a historical high from 1983, almost 2 out of 3 in favor of the project to continue. But at the same time, you have a growing number, majority in some key core member states of the European Union, that feel that there are, for the first time, existential threats for the future of the European project. The stakes are high, and they are afraid of a progressive dissolvement of the European Union. So let's say what happened wrong. I think that now we're paying the price for the mishandling of a couple of crises that have emerged in the European Union in the last decade. And I'm starting with the major crisis, which was the debt crisis. So one of the side effects of the debt crisis was that historically the EU has been an elite-led project with a couple of problems regarding democratic deficit, the peoples of Europe, and so on and so forth. For the first time, with the escalation of the crisis, we had divergent interests, clashes, and serious rifts between the member states, between the governments of the European Union. For example, the debtors versus the creditors, the North versus the South. So all these battles between the national elites have offered rise to a rising populism, depending on a variety of member states, either to the right or to the left. So for the first time, we see such growing rifts, even between the elites, even between the member states of the European Union. So I think that the major challenge from now on is that it's a race against time. So our fear is doing too little, too late.
So Sotiris, if I could just for a moment bring it just to where you're sitting in Greece, and if you could just tell us about what you feel as an academic there sitting in Greece. Do you think that Greece's experience, especially through the financial crisis it suffered and the austerity measures that it had to bring in after taking that loan from the EU. Do you think all of that has made Greeks more in favor or against this project?
I think that the Greeks progressively have become more skeptical. So although they understand that they do not have a fallback scenario, a plan B, okay, and the experiment that we had in 2015, at the same time, they recognize that if there isn't a credible and lasting shift of policy during the next term of office regarding the European Parliament, European Commission, and all that, the bad scenario is on the table. And there will be, especially when it comes to a society that was very resilient during the crisis. Keep in mind that Greece was the first to enter a bailout program with no firewalls, no preparation on behalf of the EU. So this has clearly affected the Europeanization process in the country.
All right, so Mark, you're sitting in what can be argued as ground zero in some regards when it comes to the European Union and Brexit and how that all plays out into all of this. Why do you think it is that the UK and its citizens decided to leave the EU? What brought them to that point?
I think there are many different elements of it, but I think the main element actually is not immigration, as the EU would like to say. I think the main element is democracy. People don't really trust the people like Jean-Claude Juncker and Barnier to represent them well. And there is good reason for it. And when they sort of use the migration card to smear the leavers, it's not well received. People don't like that sort of divisive smear campaigning. And I think people are just fed up with being treated a bit like children, paternalized. And I think that was it. If you have to isolate one single reason, I think that's the biggest reason. And I think that problem has just grown over these 3 years when we are trying to achieve a proper Brexit. So I think even more people are now sort of seeing that it's not a good democracy in Brussels.
But do you think, Mark, to be fair, that immigration has been a problem? Because that has been spoken about quite a bit as well by those who were in the Leave camp. Also, especially that of immigration, for example, from Eastern Europe.
Yes, it has certainly been a key element as well. It has, in fact, been very important. But it's not to say that the British people are sort of racists, as the Brussels would like to put it. I think what most of the British people think is that it has been mishandled, and they can't trust that Brussels can cope with the migration issue, and they just want to have someone they can trust to deal with it more responsibly. So I don't at all believe in this sort of racist thing. Of course, there's always in every population there's always a few racists, but it's not that over 50% of the British voters are racist. It's one of the most cosmopolitan countries in the world, as everyone knows. So it's just a silly argument, but they just keep repeating it, and I don't think it does them any credit.
All right, so Sotiris, one of the things that comes out a lot when we're talking about the European Union is countries like Germany, for example, and the criticism they come under for being powerhouses within the EU and then essentially dictating to other countries what to do. And I know in the case of Greece, especially throughout the bailout negotiations and right after, Merkel came under a lot of criticism there. Even during her visits to Athens, there were large protests in the country upon her visit. Do you think that that's a legitimate criticism of the fact that those who are stronger economies essentially now dictate to those who are not as strong?
Well, in principle, there is a point there because, the root cause of the Eurozone's architecture are the macroeconomic imbalances inside the member states of the Eurozone. So that is why we had this clear distinction between creditor countries and debtor countries, creditors with surplus and creditors and debtors with deficit. So on the one hand, if the one side of the economic model changes, the other side needs also to change its own economic structure. And we haven't seen tangible moves from Germany from this respect in order to guarantee a more, if you like, balanced burden sharing in the future. I think for the last 1.5 years, the German Chancellor failed to respond to the proposals put forward by the French President Macron. And I think to relate this to your first question, it's also an issue of how populism has affected even mainstream politicians that want to support the EU project and move on. So I think that Merkel was reluctant, noting the rise of populist movements and the rise of AfD inside Germany and how will this affect us. So it's a wait and see. But I think, as I told you in the beginning, in the end of the day, it has become a race against time. If we don't do something, sooner or later, the EU project might start to disintegrate, or we're going to see a series of a more fragmented Europe, especially in an era where the citizens still ask from the EU, yes, to become more democratic and take forward some bold pan-European solutions to address global problems.
Okay, it's time now for our first break. I'm going to ask our guests to stay with us. Viewers stay with us as well. We're going to continue this conversation on this topic on the other side of the break. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. We continue to discuss the European Union and this latest survey that has come out of the European Council on Foreign Relations think tank about how Europeans feel about this bloc. We're still joined by Mark and Sotiris, but we're going to add another voice to this conversation. We're also now joined by Baris, Celik, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Kent. He's joining us now from Canterbury and the UK. Baris, thanks for joining us as well here in Scope. Baris, what do you make of such surveys, especially sitting there in the UK with the context of Brexit? Do you think that it would be an overstatement or possibly even an understatement that the EU literally is falling apart?
Well, I think if you look at the survey and actually the report that is published by the group of researchers who conducted the survey, it's, I think, not an overstatement or an understatement. I think it puts the picture quite nicely in the sense that, well, I would call it divide within divide, because there is no unity in either side. So we cannot say that one side of people actually supporting this European project and on the other side there's a division. But when you look at the people who responded that there might be some negative outlook, like even war between European states, there's actually a divide between those Eurosceptic people in the sense that there are some kind of right-wing, so to speak, Eurosceptics and also left-wing Eurosceptics, and there are some major fault lines between them. And this makes it actually more difficult for the European Union to deliver what those different views actually require for the EU to do. Because, for example, the left-wing Eurosceptics are actually concerned with the economic policies of the EU, whereas when you look at the right wing, the fault line appears to be on the side of migration and freedom of movement, these kind of issues. So if the EU wants to move forward with appeasing the demand from the left-wing Eurosceptics, then of course it will have to compromise a certain level of demands from the right-wing Eurosceptics. So that's the first takeaway from this divide.
Very well. Yep.
But of course,
If I may, Baris, I wanted to come in because I wanted to pick up on one of the points that you brought up there, and I'm glad you did bring up that about the opinion about war or conflict amongst two countries and what people thought about that. Mark, 3 in 10 people polled said that conflict among countries within the EU was a realistic possibility. And now I'm just going to pick out, one area of disagreement. For example, we recently had Italy and France falling out between each other over the Yellow Vests and Italy's support for the Yellow Vests. Italy, of course, having a significantly right-wing government out in place. And I'm not saying that that would lead to conflict, but I'm just saying that those sorts of disagreements, do you think that that would actually genuinely lead to conflict?
Yes, I mean that's a fascinating question because I think that sort of digs into the great divide here, how your world outlook from Divas and Romanos. I think the EU side, of course, they say that nationalism brings wars, so we have to have a supranationalist structure, and then we will never have wars again. Whereas those of us on the other side are saying that if you put a supernatural structure on top of nations that have well-respected and well-established borders, that's when you get friction. If we take Europe, for example, I think one of what has made Europe so unique for 500 years is that we have had nation states, and we have not had concentration of power in one point. And every time that has been attempted, it has led to wars. And now the EU is trying to do the same thing. So I see the danger, and many leaders see the danger in amassing power on top of the well-established parliaments we already have. But of course, the EU is having the contrary view, and that's leading back to your question. Then of course, you have to also argue that when you get friction, that's because we don't have enough EU. But I think because of EU, that's why we have this friction. You were mentioning between Italy, Greece, Berlin, Budapest, London as well. We have all this friction. But it's because of the EU, in my view, that we have all this friction. So if we play down the EU, make it smaller, or take it down and create something else, which is more in line with what voters once voted for, I think then we will reduce all the friction.
Okay, so Sotiris, I wonder what you make of that, because you're in Greece, and it can be argued that Greece not only has gone through the bailout and the austerity, etc., but on the other side, it's also dealing with a wave of asylum seekers / refugees, and Greece would look at other European Union countries which are much richer and say, why aren't you doing your part? That's an argument that even Italy has put forth. Do you think that is all down to the European Union project, or would those sorts of complaints exist even if the bloc did not exist as it is today?
Well, I think that Greece has invested a lot in the project, not only for economic reasons, but also for issues of national security, including internal and external security. Of course, Greece has been disappointed regarding the management of the refugee crisis between the member states of the European Union, and the lack of solidarity towards frontline states like Greece and Italy. We understand, however, that this is a crucial issue for the future of the project. And this is one of the reasons that we need to cooperate and enhance our supranational integration, because, we're not living in an era when you can build a fortress Europe, or every nation state by itself is sufficiently capable to protect itself. Otherwise, we're going to have, I think, a spillover effect. On the other hand, I think that Greece has progressively becomes a frontline state for the West, and an extra reason why Greece wants for the EU project to stay alive is also to act as an external balancing factor towards Turkey, with the country that we have the major national security issues, I think, on the table.
But Baris, I wonder what you make of that, because again, all these countries that are taking in these waves of asylum seekers and refugees, again, they look at the situation and see that it's quite unfair, isn't it? That they're having to deal with all of this, and that many or most of the other European countries, especially the rich ones, are not doing their part, again, in their opinion. Do you think that is one fracture line, which is something that can divide even further Europeans?
Well, certainly that is a major fault line. As I said at the beginning, this is actually very important for the right-wing Eurosceptics, and this is actually something that differentiates them from the left-wing Eurosceptics. But on the other hand, this migration issue has a normative background as well. So in 2015, for example, more than 800 people died while trying to cross through Mediterranean, through southern European states, and that was actually the most important incident since the Second World War in the Mediterranean in terms of loss of life. And it became more difficult for European governments to reject those demands to conduct, for example, search and rescue operations. But of course, Eurosceptics say that this actually encourages people to try and migrate into Europe through a more dangerous way, because they can make sure that they will be searched and rescued after all. But of course, this has also a rational background in it as well, in the sense that most of the, especially Eurosceptic parties, are giving that it causes a lot of burden on the taxpayers, and it causes more asylum seekers in their homeland. So this is a major fault line, as you said. Just briefly to touch upon the divide in terms of whether there will be a continental European divide or is it about EU. I think it's actually very important that Mark emphasized The divide is mostly caused by EU integration projects, not the European cooperation. So we have to differentiate the EU and the European integration, because in the recent years we have been seeing that there is actually a bilateral and trilateral cooperation tendency rather than cooperation under the framework of EU, which is also very important, I think.
All right, so Mark, when many look at the European Union project, they would have seen that this is a strong bloc of these many countries coming together, uniting, and they have certain stances which, again, not everybody in the European Union agrees upon. But if I may use an example, such as the Iran nuclear deal. Now, the United States walked away from that, but Europe says it very much still wants that deal to remain alive. It is trying, in its own way, to bring forth vehicles for financial transactions, et cetera, at the very least humanitarian aid otherwise. But then on the other side, one wonders, is Europe strong enough to withstand U.S. pressure, for example? Or is Europe genuinely just weak, either together or either separated?
Yeah, I think Europe was really strong 10, 15 years ago, because before it has really started to expand beyond the voter mandate. But most of us in Europe voted for economic cooperation, not so much a political overcoat. And when it started to create this political overcoat, even though most people didn't really want it and said no when it was asked, then it has started to be weaker. So I think it's a lot weaker now than it was only 10 years ago, because it doesn't have the support of the people anymore. So I think scaling back, it would be strong again. But at this point, it's this division we are seeing now between the establishment and voters. We haven't seen that in over 100 years, and before introduction of democracy. So of course that has weakened Europe in a major way. And when it comes to handling issues such as Iran or US, I think it's always Berlin and Paris who makes the decisions anyway. So it's not 28 or 27 countries coming together. It's two countries, and the other one have to tail them. So I think that the argument comes out like that very often, but I think it has to be looked upon in a different way.
Okay, so Sotiris, as Mark, there genuinely the view is that yes, Berlin and Paris would make many of the political decisions, especially, and many of the economic decisions that could be argued as well for the bloc. What do you make of that? Do you think that Greeks or other Europeans would agree with that point of view, A? And B, is that necessarily a bad thing? Have they necessarily made bad decisions for the bloc?
I think that what is important is that, first of all, to have a rebalance of the Franco-German axis that we had in the past. The axis is still imbalanced as a result of the debt crisis. That is why we've seen the last couple of years France to be more actively engaged in the fields of foreign security and defense in order to have a more balanced, approach. The bad thing is that, and this also comes out of the survey, that this is the last chance in terms of the French political establishment. If that fails, everything that is behind Macron is either seriously Eurosceptic or even, anti-European. The one thing for sure is that we do not need one member state that will lead alone. We need to protect the core of the member states. And what I would like also to underline is the fact that the young people are more afraid, especially the target groups from 18 to 34, 35, about the future of the project, even about a potential war in Europe. It means that these are the new generations that do not have any memories from the devastating experience from the first half of the 20th century, where the continent produced 2 world wars. And this is something that seriously contributes to the start of the European project. So I think for the first time we see that all this is taken for granted by the peoples of Europe. But in reality, this is just a short break in one of the most blood territories of the world. So there is a new narrative with more democracy. I would agree with Mark that anti-establishment is on the rise. Winners and losers of globalization are a new, different group compared to the traditional division between right and the left. And we see how the overall challenges to globalization will play out in the end and will affect the continent. As I told you at the beginning, the challenge is not to make it too little, too late. And I'm afraid that we've seen the Germans the last few years, supporting a wait-and-see position. I think that we need more swift decisions. Otherwise, the project will be challenged. And the EU in the past has been invested a lot in what we say, I think, a legitimacy that was based on the result-oriented legitimacy.
Right.
Now that the citizens do not have the result that we're expecting, especially regarding economics, migration, all that, they challenge the process as a whole. So they want more transparency, more democracy. It's not only an issue of democratic deficit, it's an issue of political deficits. For example, I'm going to vote for the new members of the European Parliament, but how exactly my vote will turn into a policy preference and into some concrete decisions taken from Europe, from one party or another. I think that the social legitimacy of the EU at the moment is a bit
All right,
low.
Sotiris, I'm gonna interrupt you there. I do apologize. It seems the clock has gotten the best of us for this segment, but of course we do appreciate. I'm going to say goodbye to two of our guests, Baris and Sotiris. We appreciate, of course, their time and their insight for discussing the European Union with us. We're going to stick with Mark, though, for our next segment. We're going to be discussing Brexit, of course, again, within the context and an extension of that discussion about European Union, but more just about Brexit and what's been happening within the UK regarding that. Stay with us for that segment. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. Now, in the first segment, we spoke about the European Union and many European citizens' opinions on that, coming out of a think tank survey. Most, or many, I should say at least, not very optimistic about the future of the EU, even about conflicts within EU members and about the bloc as a whole possibly falling apart in the future. Now, as an example of that, we can talk about Brexit, of course, and what's been happening with Brexit over the past few days. And we now know that Jeremy Corbyn, the opposition Labour Party leader, has said discussions with Theresa May have gone as far as they can, blaming what he's called the government's increasing weakness and instability because of infighting within the Conservatives, and it can be argued really infighting within the Labour camp as well. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're still joined by Mr. Mark Brolin, who is still with us. He's a political analyst, economist, and author. He's joining us still from London in the UK. And we're now joined also by Peter Verovšek, who is a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Sheffield. He's joining us now from Sheffield in the UK. Peter and Mark, thanks for joining us. Peter, what do you make of Jeremy Corbyn's statement? Is he correct in that it's hard really to be discussing and negotiating with a government which you know will change possibly in the coming months, and we don't know whoever comes into power will be more in the Leave camp and not really want to negotiate at all?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. The problem from the start has been the fact that there are no guarantees that any agreements that Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party reached now with Theresa May would be upheld by any future government, a government that seemingly now is probably only weeks away. And additionally, it's unclear to me from the start to what extent these talks ever had any chances of succeeding, even without that problem, given the difficulties that Labour has had in pinning itself down on a position on Brexit, the divisions within the Labour coalition, and also the fact that even if an agreement had been reached, it's not clear if it would have helped, as getting Labour members on board, the concessions necessary to do that might have meant Theresa May losing just as many members of her own Conservative coalition.
So, Mark, I wonder what you make of this breakdown in negotiation. You think that this was May just being a weak prime minister? Has she finally come to the end of the road?
Yes, I think she has. And I think what these talks were initiated because she was sort of desperate to cling on. And I think, as Peter was also saying, that the success ratio was close to zero already from start. So she was playing a game to perhaps find something along the line, but she doesn't have the support of a party. And of course, as Jeremy Corbyn is saying now, that we can't settle a deal because we don't know who's going to be in Downing Street in a couple of weeks, so they can just undo it. And I think this similar type of game was played by the Labour camp because they don't really want to do a deal with May now. The Conservative Party has almost halved its support in 1.5 months. It's incredible what has happened, and this has given him a major chance to actually get to Downing Street. might not happen anyway, but it's his best chance he has had since he became a Labour leader. So I think it had been a game on both sides.
But I imagine, Mark, it would be argued that, listen, what else could May do? I mean, everyone was actually, or no, I shouldn't say everyone, but many analysts were actually happy that she reached across the board and put her hand out towards Labour. Was that not a good move in your opinion?
Well, in a way, I mean, it's nice to just try to see if you can reach a consensus. But I think, as it was part of the game, I think it might. Yeah, perhaps it's better to try. And now we know it doesn't work. You can see it like that. But if it was in bad faith from start, then it's not. Then I guess it's not a good thing. But I think personally, I think it should have been done 2 years ago. And then you could have tested each other out. At this point, she has such a diminishing support that she's probably going to go now in a couple of weeks.
All right, so Peter, okay, if I may go on to Peter, then if May does go down, and we know that some people are saying that there's a June timeline apparently for her to announce her resignation of sorts, or it may very well happen earlier, of course, if she throws a surprise at us. But if May walks away, Peter, does that really change anything, or does that in fact then harden positions in the Conservative Party? Would a pro-Brexiteer who is even harder in his or her respective position come into power?
If we look right now at the main candidates, and it seems right now that there are over 20 people within the Conservative Party that have thrown their hat into the leadership contest, it does look like most of those people are on the more pro-Brexit side. I do think that in that situation, no deal becomes much more likely. I think the chances of May's deal passing obviously go down considerably. But I doubt actually that anything fundamentally changes, given that Parliament has basically shown itself unable to agree on just about anything, even in indicative voting processes. So in some ways, I'm not sure, even if May were to hold on, I think no deal has always been, in some sense, the default scenario, because that was this only scenario that did not require Parliament.
And is a no deal as scary as it sounds, Peter? Because, you know, whenever a no deal is brought up, everyone on all sides agrees that no, we do not want a no deal scenario. But at the same time, others would argue that, listen, it's probably not that bad a thing if it's going to be the default position anyways.
I think a lot of what ends up happening with no deal will depend on good faith on both sides. I imagine that sort of we won't have all food deliveries cut off, and that some of the worst predictions probably won't come true. It's unclear to me, however, what exactly a no-deal scenario would solve. In the end, even the Irish backstop and issues like the exit payment that many pro-Brexiteers find very difficult to swallow, if those issues aren't solved with the withdrawal agreement, they will certainly be brought up again when the UK comes to the EU to negotiate a permanent trade agreement or some sort of customs arrangement after it officially exits. And at that point, I'm sure the backstop and the Irish border will be on the agenda, the payments will be on the agenda, and all of these issues will still have to be worked out. So it's unclear exactly what it solves. I don't imagine the worst predictions will come true, but it will still certainly be disruptive.
So, Mark, what do you make of a no deal scenario? Would it be as bad as some people have said? And B, in the case of a no deal scenario, the UK would still in some ways find itself in a bit of a corner, wouldn't it? Because it would need to, obviously, in that case, negotiate some sort of a trade deal with the bloc, wouldn't
it? Yes, but I think with a no deal, we would get into a new situation. Then both sides would have to focus on a trade deal, and that's what the Brits have been trying to achieve all the time. But Brussels hasn't agreed to do that until we have solved the money issue and the Irish backstop. But we would sort of resettle the score if we had a no deal. And I think, as Peter also was saying, that it's much exaggerated. I think it's even more exaggerated than he said. What would happen in a no deal? We would have WTO terms for a while, and it would quite quickly, I think, be able to achieve a proper deal. Because as it is now, we have just run into a corner when nothing happens. So I think it's the only way out. I mean, it's not a scenario anybody would want, but there is no good scenario at this point. And I think the best realistic scenario at this point is to leave and then start again.
But then, Mark, shouldn't we be worried about the backstop issue to begin with? Well, because that can then bring up a whole bunch of, historical sentiments, which I imagine no one would want to, the rise of the new IRA, as it's being called, and that little bit of violence we've seen recently in those areas. That's a very sensitive topic, isn't it? And I imagine trying to poke at that isn't a good idea.
No, it is a sensitive issue, but I think it has been overplayed for political reasons, because the UK doesn't really want a hard border. It's the Brussels which is saying that there has to be a hard border if there is no deal. And I think if with goodwill on both sides, it can be actually dealt with in a proper way. They are trying to make fun in Brussels of sort of the technical solutions, but there are technical solutions that can work. We have these. Between the US-Canadian border, for example, Norwegian-Sweden border, and the Swiss border, there is solutions to this. And perhaps if you have to slow down your car a little bit, and the camera is taken of your car when you cross the border, that would be okay. But it wouldn't be a hard border in the sense that we saw in the 70s. So I think this has been massively overplayed for political reasons. And I think the Irish are starting to see this as well.
That's an interesting point of view. Peter, I wonder if you, at that last one, do you think this has been overplayed, this issue of the hard border?
I would actually disagree completely. I actually think that the issue of Ireland has been underplayed from the start by a lot of English politicians, and I don't think that the technical solutions are realistic. I think anybody who has ever been to the US-Canadian border, where you don't just slow down your car, you usually end up waiting long periods. Average truck waiting times are incredibly long. It is a hard border. There is, to be fair, increased cooperation on both sides, and there have been attempts to do that. And to facilitate things, but it is certainly a border you have to stop at. It is certainly a border where checks are regularly carried out and where wait times, on average, are over an hour. And in terms of supply chains, that's obviously going to be problematic, especially given that some farms exist on both sides of the border. And I do think also that the symbolism is going to be very dangerous. And I think the other aspect that I don't think has been paid, enough attention has been paid to, is the fact that just the presence of a border, just getting these technical solutions going, there will be a border there. And that, in essence, is a repudiation of the Good Friday Agreement. And if that agreement goes, I think, again, the symbolism, but also the real effects of that have been underestimated, especially given that tensions are already on the rise and we already have seen some violence start and some rearming start in Ireland.
So, Mark, one of the other issues that come up a lot when we're talking about Brexit is that of the theory that a second referendum would solve all these issues. Many people are saying that during this first referendum, the people were misinformed. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely wrong, because misinformed, you can put that argument that it was. There were major exaggerations on both sides, and the Brussels side is only talking about the leaders' exaggerations. But on the other side, they were just as big. They were talking about recession, immediate recession, and 3 million jobs lost and all that. That didn't play out. So I think in every campaign there are sort of falsehoods or campaign exaggerations, and I just think it's not going to be as bad as people are saying.
Peter, I wonder what you make of that. Do you think that was misinformation, A, and B, that a second referendum should occur?
I think certainly there was misinformation. I think Mark is right that there is misinformation in every campaign. I do think it was taken to certain brazen heights in the Brexit campaign, and then in other campaigns that have occurred recently. In terms of a second referendum, I do think that in some ways a second referendum is probably the only way of resolving these issues without a no-deal Brexit. Whether that would even work is unclear. I do think that a lot of polarization has become the whole political spectrum here has become so polarized, it's not clear that we would get any more definitive a result. And if anything, I think the first referendum showed the difficulty of resolving these problems. What I would say is that any referendum or any future referenda on these issues in the UK should take the 4 nations or the 3 nations that compose the UK into account. I do think that having a 50% referendum that is just a majority referendum across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland is very problematic, especially given that those other areas see themselves as separate nations. There should be a threshold where all of the different parts of the UK in any constitutional type referendum have a say in these things, not just the English, who by just their sheer numbers can overwhelm the desires of the Scots and the Northern Irish.
And you brought up a very good point there, Peter, because Mark, there the whole Scottish independence issue once again being spoken of by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Do you think that whatever really happens going forward, that these sorts of divisions that we've seen now across the United Kingdom in different areas, where certain areas overwhelmingly voted to stay, for example, and some areas voted to leave, that those sorts of divisions within the country, A, have weakened how united this kingdom really is, and B, have given rise to more calls for independence?
In a way, for now it has weak. I mean, it has created divisions. Everyone is upset on all sides, so that is true in a sense. But I think also one major point that is never made is everyone is upset on both sides. Everyone is sort of smearing each other. But on both sides, the majority of people actually want the same thing. I think people want leavers and remainers alike. The vast majority, they want international cooperation, but they don't want to have it happen at the cost of democracy. And so there is much more common ground than is played for. So career politicians on both sides are sort of playing up the divisions and creating divisions that shouldn't be there, because just about everyone is sort of most of us belong sort of to middle class, and we want some sort of middle way in many ways. And now we have created this situation where everyone is upset, and it is unnecessary. And I think actually things could settle down much more quickly, because people are not reactionaries on either side. People want backtracking from excess, but they just see the excess in different places. Labour sees it in Brussels. Brussels sees it in some sort of nationalism. And I think the Scottish card, I think that again, I would say that because I believe it, but I think that's also overplayed. Verovšek was in Edinburgh yesterday and talked, and he actually got a quite good reception. And he was saying that the Scottish people are not going to get independence if they leave the UK and then are ruled from Brussels. And I think there were 30% of the Scots that voted to leave. So I don't think the Scottish appetite for leaving the UK is that great, actually. I mean, of course, there are lots of people who talk about it, but there is so much bad blood whipped up. And at the end of the day, people want to have independent nations, and they want proper democracy.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there as a final. Walk has gotten the best of us, but of course we appreciate both of your time, insight, and analysis. We're going to say thank you to Mark and Peter. They're speaking to us respectively from their locations in the United Kingdom. Now, viewers, as Mark there brought up at the end of his answer there, the term bad blood really comes to mind when it comes to how we discuss Brexit and even the European Union, really. There are so many divisions within the bloc, and those divisions have now passed on to within the UK as well, all around divisions, all around seemingly divide and rule. Politicians essentially doing that for their own gains in the European Union. We will now have the Brexit Party and other such parties rising significantly in numbers of seats that they will have at the European Parliament. That's according to all, if not most polls. And then we have within the UK as well the possibility that an even more pro-Brexit Prime Minister may come into power after Theresa May, according to many accounts, inevitably has to now walk away, considering she has very much failed in her efforts to bring forth Brexit as, quote-unquote, she says, the voters wanted. We're going to keep a very close eye on the European Union elections as well as how Brexit plays out here in Skopje. But I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.